Yeah. Okay, I need to start again. Okay, well, the TNRD acknowledges that we connect with many First Nations communities across our vast regional district. And today we're located on the Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc territory, situated within the unceded ancestral lands of the Secwépemc Nation. The TNRD appreciates the partnership that we have with Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc and respect the territory and the land in which we gather today. First item of business is the minutes from the April 20th meeting of 2022. Are there any errors or omissions? Move the minutes for approval. Seconded. Call the question. Anyone opposed? And none. Not you're in favor. Motion is carried. Then we're moving on to reports. Finance Committee terms of reference. Pass this off to
Thank you, Chair
Ms.
Rain.
Campbell.
Thank you. I'm hoping that this is fairly straightforward, but as the board recently approved, we're going to dissolve all the bylaws related to our committees. And we've made a number of changes to our committees. And one of those changes was having the existing audit committee turn into a finance committee that would still have some of the audit functions that it currently has, but with an expanded scope. And so this terms of reference, we're moving towards a new template. We've done a review of other local governments, mostly regional district finance committees. So this is a new template, and then we've hopefully captured what we think the intent of this finance committee will be. But of course, we want to present it to the audit committee now so that we can get your feedback. And if there's anything that we're missing or anything that you want changed, or if you have any questions. I don't know if Mr. Ray wants to add anything. And so Chair Rains, just a note on that, we sort of just, Mr. Ray and I spoke about what we thought would be the appropriate number of members, as well as the number of times that the committee would meet per year. But of course, we're open to other suggestions.
Yeah, the only thing I was thinking that we want to have is some kind of discussion about the establishment of business cases for future expenditures in the terms of reference, so that we don't get things just popping up. And there was that piece. And then the other part was the notion of finance and audit. And I know that there seemed to be some discussion about those being conflicting themes, that you should really have your audit at arm's length from your finance, but other organizations seem to use the term finance and audit. So just wondering about your comments on both of those.
Mr. Ray, it's your wheelhouse, so turn it over to you.
Yeah, I understand where the question might be coming from, but I from what I've seen in my experience, it's quite common to have that combined finance and audit committee. You know, you're really still in the audit side of things. I guess there's two ways of looking at it. One has to do with the external independent auditor, discussing with them where, you know, risks might be, and helping guide the planning around the audit, and then receiving the findings and making a recommendation to the board. I don't think there's a conflict between that role and a committee that itself also has responsibility to look more deeply at the finances on a regular basis. And it probably helps the committee understand where those risks would lie and help with that discussion with the external auditor. There's still that independence of the external auditor. So I guess in my mind, I don't see a real conflict. You're not auditing yourselves. Yeah, on the business case matter, I do tend to agree with you. Under the terms of reference here, and this is one of the things that Ms. Campbell and I were discussing, under the mandate of the committee, the first thing it says is review approved budgets and financial plans. And one of the questions I had around that phrasing was, how does that impact the budget planning of the TNRD? Is there an expectation that we bring all budget related items to the committee for review prior to taking it to the board for approval? And I think the intent was that would not be the case, that the budget process would still involve the entire board. But that then the finance committee would have a role in saying, okay, here are the approved budgets. How are we doing? Is everything going according to plan? And looking at things like internal controls and compliance. So in the case of a business case, it really kind of falls into the budget development side. But I agree with you. I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure it really has an impact on the terms of reference for this committee, but perhaps there would be a review of business cases prior to them being introduced into the budget that go to the board. There is a piece in here about providing advice and or recommendations to the board regarding financial impacts to strategic board priorities and initiatives. Certainly business cases would enter into that in terms of providing estimates around what those financial impacts would be.
Yeah, it's
I don't know if that fully answers your question.
supplemental, if I may, Chair Rain. I guess I'm fully in agreement with the board having control of the budget, which they have to have anyway, and that budget development and approval process. What I'm more concerned about is changes to the approved budget that seem to come up all of the time, and what is the mechanism in and around those things. There's a urgent and emergent issues that come forward. I get that, but we need to not just throw money at it. We need to have a business case that would be able to show anyone why we've decided on a half an FTE, or whether what we've decided on in terms of equipment or whatever. But I wanted some rigor around how those requests come in. And it wasn't my suggestion that that be the domain of the committee, but rather for you to be able to assert to the organization that you can't just come to me with a need for a whole bunch of stuff in the library division or in the fire department division. This is the kind of formatting that we expect to accompany a request, so that I, as the chief financial officer, have a paper trail in which to explain why I made these decisions or these recommendations to the board.
Yeah, and I fully agree with that.
So do you want an amendment to the mandate to add business case or suitable wording, or can you just do that?
Through the,
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in discussion now. We can propose changes.
yeah, through the chair to Director Quinn and previously Director Christian's comments, I do think that it would be appropriate for business cases for changes to the budget to come to this finance committee for review, because that way at least there's been a select group that have reviewed those, and then Mr. Ray can take those business cases to the entire board when there's changes, and at least there's been a bit of a checks and balance before we actually make those changes or take those changes to the board. So I think we can certainly update the terms of reference to include that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think, and I do think that was the intent with the whole review approved budgets and financial plans. And Mr. Ray and I talked about this, that would include changes to the budget, but I think we need to actually explicitly state that here through this business case process.
How would you want that worded then? Because I'll make that amendment under bullet I, HI, right?
Yeah, actually, if I may, I put carry out quarterly financial reviews and advise the board on financial position of the TNRD and recommend any budget amendments necessary.
Supported by business.
Supported by business.
Yeah, okay, that sounds what we're talking about. So I'll move that out.
Second.
Yeah,
And if we
thank
got
you.
that,
Any more discussion?
okay, I have a question.
Yeah, maybe
Oh,
just
no.
staff, we haven't called them out yet, but the question, but does staff have any comments to that?
No, I agree with that. That sounds like a proper amendment. The wording sounds right to me.
Okay,
Okay,
good, then I just called the question,
on the amendment,
yeah. In favor, proposed to you,
okay, thanks. The question I wanted to ask, the 2.1 is going to be the mandate as amended. Does that meet the requirements of the company that did the forensic audit? It meets those requirements?
Through the chair to Director Quinn, we believe it does. And so we post BDO forensic audit and issuing the recommendations. We did clarify with them what they were looking for, what they were suggesting in terms of the expanded scope of the audit committee to include finance related matters. And part of the recommendation was also not just that we expand the scope, but to be a little more clear in the terms of reference, because if you look at the existing audit committee terms of reference, it's just 3 lines, really. It's really broad. And so the intent here was to try and give some direction to this newly formed finance committee. So we believe that it does meet the recommendations of BDO. Not all of them, because there's some that we're still considering related to audit compliance. And I believe Mr. Ray will probably address that later when we get to the RFP for auditing services. But essentially, we do feel that this does capture what BDO had recommended in terms of the expansion of the scope of the audit committee.
Okay, just reassure me that the scope of this is not the finance committee is going to manage how many pencils the finance department buys. I don't think that's what the mandate really should be at all.
That's certainly not going to be the mandate, and I hope that what we have here doesn't.
I don't think it does, but I
Okay.
had to ask the question.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
I don't think that's what we should be doing. That's, with all due respect, your guys' job.
Absolutely.
How
We
much stationery you need, et cetera. That's just an example.
Absolutely. We still want to ensure that there's a distinction between operational matters related to finance and financial administration, which the finance department does, and the distinction between that and governance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm happy then with that. Al.
I agree.
I have a couple of questions. Yeah, the very first one, review the approved budgets and financial plan. I said that's a approved budget by the board. Then it's somewhat redundant. Coming back to the audit committee, I don't totally understand that, and I had thought that, and it's a question, is there a role where you review the preliminary budget and you make a recommendation to the board? So going the other way, before it's approved, have a look at it and then make recommendations to the board. Now that puts another step in before it gets to the board, but it would seem to me that that would be the rational way that a finance committee would operate. If it's already approved, then there's really no work for the finance and audit committee.
Chair, sorry, Doug.
Sorry, Chair Rain. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from about that. I had the same question when Ms. Campbell and I were discussing it. It's, I think the way I understand it would be that once we have budgets approved from the board, the role of the finance committee would then be looking at the execution and the compliance, so that we would be showing you what the actual results were compared to the budget. And, again, the discussion of have plans changed out of necessity and what's the impact of that. So it would be, a monitoring role. I had that same question about, should there be a role where we do preliminary presentations to the finance committee of a draft budget before it goes to the board? And, from a purely theoretical point of view, I really have no problem with that. And I always welcome feedback. The issue that could arise is the timing, because as you say, it adds that extra layer, that extra step before the budget goes to the board. And I'm just not sure that we always have time to allow for that step, only because of the legislative deadlines that we face in having the budget approved. Yeah.
That could be organized ahead. certainly normally on the board, it's the board's first review before committee.
Yeah.
First review, and then it would go to a board corporately, and certainly I can say in Sun Peaks and municipality, Finance and Audit Committee are looking at the budget, the preliminary budget ahead of the council's review.
Yeah, and certainly in the fall with a provisional budget, that's less of a problem. What I find is because the regional district has an earlier deadline at the end of March than municipalities do to have the budget approved, often there's a very small window of time before we have all of the information from the previous year end in February to finish a budget and have it ready to go to the board in March.
Yeah, I guess the other thing we look at is you did review some other regional districts and what they're doing. Ask the question, how many actually have like finance and audit committees, or do some just have audit committees, or is this more or less the majority of regional districts are into finance and audit?
Yeah, so our review showed that there was a few, that maybe two that we found that had audit committees, but mostly finance committees, or what they would call finance and governance.
Yeah.
And the terms of reference for those committees was quite similar to what we propose here.
Yeah, I don't think we really don't have to finalize this today, do we? I mean, I guess I would ask the question if we should be looking at whether or not there is a role for a finance committee in reviewing preliminary budget prior to it going to the board.
Chair, and I'll let members of the committee weigh in on that, but in terms of your question about the first point under mandate, review, approve budgets and financial plans, I think Mr. Ray explained sort of what our rationale was for that. And then related to what Director Christian had said, adding in that business cases would be brought forward to this committee. So you're reviewing the approved budget and financial plans and looking at business cases that have come forward that are proposing changes to the approved budget and financial plans. And one of the things that Mr. Ray and I have talked about, because we plan to increase the number of committee of the whole meetings next year, is to look at having like budget workshops at our committee of the whole meetings. So to have a preliminary budget go to the entire board sitting as a committee to provide feedback. I don't know if Mr. Ray wants to weigh in on that, but that might also be a way of sort of getting feedback and input from the entire board on the budget prior to it being brought to the board for final approval.
Yeah, no, I just, I think with a broader board, then you'd have broader input, but, or sorry, a broader committee. You would have the input, but you need it one way or the other. It just seems, to me, I mean, certainly from a corporate point of view, you wouldn't operate like this. You wouldn't have a finance and budget committee.
Yeah.
And that goes straight to the board before it goes to the financing and audit committee. The other question I have is, would the finance and audit committee not be involved in drawing up the terms for or approving the terms for requests for proposal and selection of auditors? At least to recommend to the board?
Well, that's a good question. I certainly have anticipated that the audit committee / finance committee would be involved in that. And that's the next report we have, is the discussion of that for the upcoming RFP. It's a good question though, under
But I think
mandate,
it should be under the mandate that they would approve the terms of reference for the request for proposals and make a recommendation on selection of auditors to the board.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If you think about our procurement process for other services, we don't have a similar mandate for a board or committee. We have a procurement policy, and it's largely based on best practices as laid out, both what other governments are doing, but also as laid out in trade agreements and so forth. largely based on dollar value. So the dollar value of the audit is such that it really kind of falls under in the purely looking at the procurement process as an administrative task. You know, we wouldn't necessarily take it to the board for approval. But having said that, because it is I don't know if I call it sensitive, but because it does have that role as an independent safeguard, you know, around finances, there may be a different point of view on it. I certainly, you know, in terms of the, and again, we'll talk to it in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. I like having the assurance that who we're hiring as an auditor going through that process is a group decision and not something I'm potentially exposing myself to a not necessarily a conflict of interest, but the perception of a conflict of interest.
Well, in my estimation, it's absolutely unacceptable
Yeah.
that the staff would make a recommendation to the board on the selection of the auditors or the terms of that. That is truly responsibility of finance and audit. Now, staff would obviously help in the preparation and the review and those things, but I think just given what we came through in the last 2 years, we need a step between what is being recommended by staff and what's going to the board. Ms. Campbell.
Chairine. So I believe that we would treat the RFP process for auditing services the same way we would treat any of our RFPs. So we're bound to follow our procurement policy in the Northwest Partnership Trade Agreement. And we're also bound to establish evaluation criteria. And we're not able to just have one individual rate the proposals. It has to be a team of staff that rate the proposals. And it's not just based on price. Price is one of them. It would be other things like experience and previous quality of work. And then, so my understanding is the process in the past would be that an evaluation team would go through that process with the audit RFP, rate those proposals, and then based on that scoring, there would obviously be a successful proponent that would come out of that, which would be presented to this audit committee just sort of for endorsement. I don't believe that the audit committee would actually sit around with the evaluation criteria and evaluate the proposals, but I could be wrong. I wasn't here at the time. So I do think that's still the appropriate process, just because it is a very administrative function to evaluate and put out RFPs and to evaluate any proposals that come in for any services. And that's sort of in line, well, it is in line with our procurement policy, but I don't, Mr. Ray can.
No, you're absolutely right. The process historically would be to go through the RFP process, do a ranking based on a number of criteria, bring forward a recommendation to the audit committee, and then be able to answer any questions about how we came to that recommendation. And then generally we would have a recommendation from the audit committee to the board to accept the recommendation.
Yeah.
But I don't know how that
I mean, I
differs
think
from what we're talking about.
certainly that's where I'm coming from, is that the work is done in the assessments, but who is responsible in the end? The staff are responsible for carrying out all of this work, and then the audit's done. I mean, you do the work, but I think the responsibility to endorse that as a recommendation to the board still has to rest with the Finance and Audit Committee, because you're a little bit arm's length away from administration. The administration kind of doing this on its own, and just going back to the board, to me, I keep thinking back 2 years ago and finding out what was going on way after the fact. If the Audit and Finance Committee is going to have a role, they better have a role in making that recommendation to the board.
Terry, and I think I think what we, we could build it into the terms of reference, just to make it a little more clear, but I think that's still the intent. I think staff would undertake the evaluation of the proposals based on an established evaluation criteria. And then that would go to, and perhaps it's presenting a little bit more details to the committee, in terms of where that, how that evaluation criteria was established, how all the proposals were scored. Again, I don't have the past history as to whether or not that level of detail was provided to the audit committee when proposals would come in for previous auditing services. I'm not sure. But I think that there's still a role for this committee to play in that.
Yeah, I was just looking in the mandate, it's not there. Director Christian.
Yeah, I agree with Chair Rain. I think that given our recent past history and the microscope that we operate under, that there would be a couple of areas for the audit committee to kind of weigh into that selection of an external auditor. One would be in the establishment of what would be the priorities in the setting of the RFP. So a discussion at a meeting about, gee, we're about to award a contract here or send out an RFP. What do you think the main things? There's some standard things. Obviously, they have to, audit the books, but are there areas within the business operation that the board would like to see some additional oversight? And if so, do we want to call for an auditor that has some particular expertise, or somebody on staff who has some expertise in engineering, procurement, or vehicles, or whatever the heck it was that the board was interested in at that time? And I think that would establish some oversight at the top. And I don't want to be, nor have I ever been involved in the assessment of the numbers about who gets a 70% versus who gets a 60%. I did that when I worked for an organization and did that. But then when we make the recommendation as staff to the board, I think that we have to be able to show that that's a clearly independent assessment of what was submitted to us vis-a-vis the proposal. And then the board can make a decision. I think in some instances, you could put in a notion that the board would be given the decision between the top two proponents, or that the board could make a decision based on price. And I've seen both of those happen. But for the most part, there's a recommendation of somebody who most fully meets the criteria that the audit committee had established for the RFP. And that, to me, I think is the role of governance and oversight for us. Now, when I read that, I didn't see a red flag, but I hear what Al's saying in terms of maybe being more specific about that, just because of our history and the fact that the eyes of Texas are upon us in terms of those kinds of nuances.
Yeah. Thank you. And I would add, if something were to go wrong and down the road we find out we made some mistakes in what we were looking for, who is that going to fall on? And I think from an administration point of view, you want that to fall back on the audit committee. You don't want to be saying, oh, no, the audit committee wasn't involved. That was a recommendation of the administration. I just think for proper protocol in terms of responsibility, you do the work, you make the recommendations. But I mean, I think if any issue becomes a major public issue at the TNRD, administration has to rely on the fact that the board approved the budgets, the board approved these things, the committees approved those things. We don't have a direct attack on the administration at that point, because they should have been reviewed by the leadership through the committees and board structure. That's my point. So I just think we need to go back on that and take a look. Ms. Campbell.
Terry, and so I think we can add into the mandate that the committee provide advice and recommendations on the procurement process for audit services, as well as recommend or endorse the successful proponent, or recommend to the board recommend to the board.
Yeah.
Audit firm selection.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can add that in. Just for the committee's awareness, we will be bringing this final terms of reference to the board at the September meeting. So it's helpful that you give us the input now and changes that you want to see now to this draft, because the final draft will go to the board for approval at the September meeting.
Yeah, again, process, I would hope that coming out of here, maybe, we might not get all of the language that you would prefer today. But I would hope that maybe when we do a revised one, that the audit committee would receive that ahead of the board, so we can kind of sign off on that, say, hey, we have reviewed it. So the other question comes up is, and it does come up, is if we're going to do specific a third-party audit of specific parts of the TNRD budgets and financial recording, who's making that call? Is that the administration or is that Finance and Audit Committee? And I would say that it should be Finance and Audit Committee, because the administration shouldn't be making that call. Now, the committee would be working with the administration to look at where's the logical areas. But we have, or are we doing that? The recommendation from the forensic audit was that that should be done. The first question is, I mean, I think the committee has to say, should we be doing that every year? Should we be doing that from time to time? Do we make that part of the external audit? They review a department in greater depth. That's an approach. Who's making that call?
Yeah, to me, when I read the terms of reference, I think that, clearly falls under the mandate of the committee. If I just look at, 1.1, it talks about at the bottom of the paragraph that the committee would provide advice and make recommendations to the board regarding items related to financial policy, planning and reporting, as well as reviewing and monitoring the TNRD's external audit and audit compliance. And then as well, under the mandate section, there's several recommendations, advice and recommendations to the board regarding things such as financial policies, purchasing and procurement processes and policies, transparency and visibility of financial reporting. So to me, I agree that those are all things that would be kind of covered off under that advice and recommendations to the board regarding a matter that has to do with compliance with financial policies, compliance with internal controls, and the decision whether to hire an external auditor to do specific procedures around that, separate from what the financial statement audit is doing, would certainly fall within that mandate in my mind.
Yeah, I guess what I'd like to see is it being clear, being more transparent.
Yeah.
This is a role and responsibility, because it was a major issue. And I'm not sure personally I agree with completely with the recommendations from the forensic audit, but somebody and the board will eventually have to make that decision. And I would say it'd be a much it would be certainly administratively a more efficient protocol to have the Finance and Audit Committee review that and then make a recommendation to the board. And that it would be the Finance and Audit Committee with assistance from staff who make that recommendation to the board. It just didn't step up. It doesn't jump out off the page to me that this is a major issue. Director Christian.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up on that. I think Director Quinn made a comment earlier on that, we don't want to set up for having people counting pencils. But the urban legend that's out there says that we need to have that degree of oversight. And I worry that you're going to have a whole bunch of new directors sitting around here that think that they're going to come into the TNRD and start counting how many coffee cups there are, because that's what's needed, right? And what my purpose here today, after reading the document, is that we just set up a framework that actually gives the oversight and governance to the board through the board to the committee, and leaves you the ability to actually run the finance department and run the organization. And so that if we're, we maybe sound like we're a bit picky here today, but I think that if that clarity is provided in the terms of reference document, and if that's approved by the committee and recommended by this board going forward, at least in December, you're starting out from a place that is pretty clear in terms of our assessment of the last 4 years and what's gone on and what we feel necessary to, I'm not going to say right the ship, but to provide that degree of both transparency and oversight that really differentiates between the role of a director and the role of an accounting supervisor within the organization. And that's the piece that I think, first of all, I don't buy into some of the conclusions of the forensic auditor, but I think that their general sentiment was that we want to have had a greater degree of oversight, say prior to 2019 kind of thing. And that I think is something that we would quite frankly be a legacy if we could do that. And I think, I don't know, I think all three of us are on our way out. So I don't think we have a vested interest in this other than to put the organization on solid footing. And in all sincerity, that's kind of my motivation in terms of this. So.
Thank you, Ken. That's more or less what I was thinking too. My thoughts on it, we've redone all our policies and hopefully we'll have most of them completed before. Oh, that's right. I got to do this. Director Christian just about summed up what I was thinking. We've changed a lot of policies. This is just the audit part of it. And we want to leave that solid foundation because it's kind of looks like there's going to be better than 50% change here. And we want to make sure that the new guys, they can always just take it and blow it out of the water if they choose. But we really need to make sure that foundation is really solid. And I think we're getting there. And I'm just wondering if there shouldn't be a separate kind of, the audit committee looks after the budget and all that. And then we were talking about somebody coming and looking at an in-depth, maybe that should be separate from the, not separate from the audit committee or the finance department, but a separate person looking at it. Because I know one of the recommendations, or two of the recommendations, one is we should get somebody outside or internal. And the other thing was put somebody with accounting experience on the committee. Well, you're not going to know that till after the election. And you may get somebody in here that has no idea. Some people, we've been lucky, all of us here have had some knowledge of how it works. But you may be faced with, the new chair may be faced with something quite different. So that's where the policy that works comes in. So I think it's worth thinking about, at least that maybe every couple of years or so, you get somebody come in and drill down on a department. They can count the pencils rather than the entire board. And that kind of thing also would get everybody sort of goes along in their day-to-day business. And, maybe there's a mistake being made that you don't pick up on. And theoretically, the auditor does, but he may not too. So I'd like to see that happen, but not every year. I don't know quite how you'd write that in there, but those are my thoughts. I just want to make sure the foundation is really solid going forward. Thank you.
Ms. Campbell.
Thanks, Chairman. I just want to make sure, thanks the committee. Thank you to the committee for all your comments on this. I just want to make sure that we have the proper direction in terms of what we might want to add to the mandate. So just so I'm understanding, we would add into the mandate that this committee would also provide recommendations to the board on, and this is related to BDO's recommendations, on more in-depth third-party audits and review of internal controls of the organization. Is that what the committee is looking for?
Well, there are two issues there. One is the regular audit, and then the other would be the audit functions as recommended by BDO with an independent I think those are two separate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we would need to sort of make the distinction in the mandate that we're not talking about our regular audit of our financial statements. We're talking about a more in-depth, and I don't know if it's internal controls or what we would want to call it. I think that was the language that BDO used.
But I think this is on studies in terms of reference for the hiring of auditors. Who's doing that? That should be with this committee staff, and the staff go out and then come back and say, our recommendation is this company for this and this reason. This committee approves that, recommended to the board. Director Christian.
Yeah, I mean, it would be, in my mind, an exceptional circumstance that you would ask for two separate auditors in any given year. I would suggest that you would, in the instructions to the auditor, highlight areas of the business that the board feels could stand an extra examination. And it might be something as benign as the disposition of used library books or something like that, something the board's heard, from their constituents that, is going awry, and they want somebody to take a little bit more of an in-depth look at that. There might be something to do with the allocation of mileage for bylaw enforcement, those kinds of things, but they can just tack that on as a review of what they are doing in terms of the overall review of the finances of the regional district. And we have found that in the case of the city of Kamloops, where almost every year they pick an area of the enterprise and they drill down a little bit deeper there than they normally would in terms of all the other departments, right? And so that gives them something to recommend back to in our case, to the council, that look, your controls in this area seem fine, or, the reason you're getting a bunch of complaints is this, or, whatever. And it just gives that external window on that.
And just to follow on that, it's very important if we were going to do, say, an in-depth audit on functions where there's cash involved in them and exchanges of value on the front line. It's very important that come from the Finance and Audit Committee, not from the administration side, because if it comes from the administration side, the cynical person would look and say, oh, yeah, but everybody inside the administration knows that's going to be a function, so they're going to be clean this year. It needs to have that kind of arm's length decision making. Mr. Ray.
Completely agree. In terms of bringing that into the mandate, I think there's a couple of areas that jump out at me. So the one listed in our 2.1B, where it says review and comment on the findings of the external audit and audit compliance. As you know, from past history, there's also been usually a meeting with the auditors to review the planning before they conduct the audit. And there's always been an opportunity there, and this has been consistent with every audit I've ever been involved in, where the auditors will say, okay, are there areas where the committee wants us to take a deeper look? Is there a specific concern that we should be aware of that you want us to look into? And it may be simply a matter of changing that to say review and comment on the planning, the audit planning, and followed by the findings of the external auditor, something of that nature, to include the planning in there.
And make recommendations.
Yeah, and then
the board.
The other piece was the amended wording we talked about, where the mandate would be to provide advice and make recommendations to the board on external audit firm selection. Well, right there, if you just put a period there, there's kind of, we're in this room sitting there saying, well, we're really talking about the annual financial statement audit. But that could be expanded to not just include the annual financial statement audit, but any other recommendations around using external audit services for compliance-based audits, for perhaps unusual circumstances that need to be investigated. if we tweak the wording in there, I think we can capture the intent.
No, I just think we need a little reworking of some of this to get that arm's length in there.
Yeah. And then the other piece that was discussed, which I agree with, there's the recommendation from BDO about what they termed as internal audit services. Again, in the next report, when we talk about the RFP, you'll see that exactly what Director Christian was proposing is what I've put into the report to say, this is what I'm recommending we do with this RFP process. We have the external audit piece of the RFP. We want to price and we want to evaluate your ability to do the annual financial statement audit. And we also want incremental to that pricing on having staff come in who still have that independent auditing training and they're independent from the organization, who can review a program of procedures to look at policy compliance and internal controls that would be over and above what would normally be considered necessary by the firm for the regular financial statement audit. So I'm in complete agreement that that would be the right approach to layer it on as an additional service that we would want separate pricing on to make a determination on, you know, how much is it really going to cost? What is the cost benefit going to be? And we can then build a little bit more understanding about what the scope should be, how frequently they come in and how much work they do, what's really needed. And still, but in terms of the mandate, I think that our intent was that's broadly covered by the wording that's here in terms of the advice and recommendations, and especially in that 1.1 about sort of the review and monitoring of the external audit and audit compliance. To me, that kind of encompassed it, but maybe we want to be more specific.
Yeah, I just think in the mandate, my recommendation would be, you've heard where we're coming from.
Yeah.
That we go back and look at the couple of additions we've added into the mandate. Have a look at the mandate, try to keep it in the tone where there's separation between administration and the committee and board responsibilities, and send that out to us, and we'll sign off over the next few weeks, and then we have something to go to the board with. Director Quinn.
On that, the separate issue, I don't quite know how to word it. I don't want our staff, all of them, all the way from the top to the bottom, living in fear of a separate audit, because it sends the notion that they're not doing their job right. It's more to be, we want to have a look to make sure we are covering it all off. And so if we come down and say, your department's going to get done this year, it's not very, it doesn't provide for a healthy environment. And so we just have to be careful how we do that. Because I think we're doing a great job now. But we want to make sure we stay doing it. And so there has to be an understanding. And I guess that would be the administration side, that this is not coming in like a sigh to cut it all down, but it's to be encouraging and on an improvement kind of basis and anything else. I don't know if I put that right, but that's somewhere along those lines. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we can move on. I would like to get to the membership, just thoughts about members. 5 seems very reasonable to me. And I think it needs to be a minimum of 5 with his expanded role. I was just wondering if, do we leave it at least 1, 1, 1, and so then the board has, or the chair has the ability to kind of do what he wants, or would it be better having 2 from a 1 from electoral area, or 2 from electoral areas, and 2 small communities, 1 large, you know?
Well, when I read it the way it's put out, I was haunted by the recommendation that we always have a CPA. And so depending on the makeup of the board, if you leave that flexibility, then it does give the chair an opportunity to find that expertise. And it might be that two of them are from, small cities or whatever, or three of them, and it gives that kind of professional expertise.
Yeah, no, I like that, a little bit more flexibility. I just want to make sure we're happy with that. Yep,
Al,
go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I just want to remind us all that the majority of the reason we exist is to help rural areas. Yes, the municipalities are important parts of it, and yes, they pay a big chunk of it. But I don't want to see electoral areas sidelined in any way. That would be the job of a chair, I guess.
Yeah,
But
here, yes, there is flexibility, and I
Yeah.
agree with.
yeah, the chair could be an electoral director, then you've got that extra balance. It just, we also don't want to tie that person's hands.
Yeah.
And for this, is 5 enough?
I would be personally, I would say I'm comfortable with 5 at this point. Hey, that doesn't mean to say 2 years from now, the committee looks at it and said, wow, the amount of work, we never anticipated so much work in finance and audit committee. We need to expand it. I mean, it can be done.
Yeah, I can I can go on and leave that final decision later. That's just, that would then just be amendment of the terms of reference.
Yeah,
So
we're
that's the only thing
comfortable
I
with
need us and the new chair to think of is
Yeah.
that's that function. Thank you.
Are there any other comments to the paper that was submitted? Yeah, on 5.4, just language. I get the point, will not implement the committee recommendations unless directed by the board. I was also thinking that it may be advisable to say the role of the committee is advisory to the board. I think that's what we're saying there. And I'm not sure, it's almost in a negative form there, like a committee is going to be pushing administration. No, the committee acts in their advisory role. And I don't have any other issues in the paper. So do we need a motion to the committee? No, I think we should maybe come back once we see a final copy. Director.
I think the motion that the committee provide input, we've done that in spades. And that the terms of reference and recommend for board approval after a final review of the changes.
Okay, moved by Director Christian,
Yeah,
second by Director Quinn. All in favor? Yeah, motion is carried. Okay, now we're moving on to the third element is that the committee receives report and provide feedback to staff on the independent audit services. Any comments on the paper?
Can we hear from Mr. Ray first? Al?
Yeah, fine.
Thank you, and through the chair. So, yeah, the intent here is that it's time for us to do another, public procurement and competitive process to hire external auditors for the annual financial statement audit. So the process in the past, just to summarize, has been using a request for proposal document that's extended invitationally based on the dollar value. Historically, the procurement requirements under our policies are that we need to have at least 3 competitive prices to compare against. It's not at a dollar level where we're required to put it out for like general public tender on BC bid or anything like that. So historically, what we've done is invited 3 firms, local firms that we felt had the competence to conduct the audit, to propose. And it's been weighted. We've reviewed a number of numerous RFP templates that other local governments in BC have used, and and looked at the elements and making sure that what we're putting together is a reflection of the best practices out there. So the evaluation criteria is partly based on price, but not entirely. There's weighted criteria going towards, as has been spoken before, what kind of experience and qualifications they bring to the table, not just with a local office, but perhaps regionally or nationally, what kind of resources they could bring to bear if necessary. Things like references and staffing capacity. Do they have the capacity to respond if we need additional work done, that kind of thing. So in the past, we've, as staff, have evaluated those criteria and brought a recommendation forward to the audit committee for a firm selection. What's different this time? A couple of things. One is that there's now additional audit firms of larger size in the marketplace. So as I say in the report, specifically MNP now has an office, and they're one of the larger audit firms in Canada, offices across the country. They now have an office here in town. And Grant Thornton now has an office here in town. So rather than sort of 3 or maybe 4 firms to potentially select to invite for a proposal, there's a few more. The other thing that was sort of being taken into account was, again, the BDO audit recommendations and the idea of setting term limits on an incumbent firm, where they have a recommendation that, and I think the wording, if I remember the exact wording, was something along the lines of frequent rotation of audit partners and change in selection of audit firms. They don't really define frequent, but it's essentially the concept of setting a term limit where we say, if you're selected as an audit firm, we're going to set a limit to how long you can act in that capacity before we're going to move firms. And seeing as KPMG has been our firm for a number of years, with this audit RFP, we would suggest that what we would do is simply not invite KPMG to propose in this round. We would look at least 3 other firms to select from. And then the idea going forward would be we would have a term limit. And I'm thinking for myself a recommendation of maybe 10 years where we do an RFP every 5, but I'm not sure what the committee thinks about that. In my own mind, with that process, if we were to continue doing an invitational RFP, the incumbent this turn would not be considered for selection. 5 years from now, we would go through another RFP process where they would be again invited. We could have both the incumbent and the previous incumbent and any number of firms invited. And then once you hit the 10-year mark, if you're still with that same audit firm, then you again go through a process of purposefully looking to change firms. That would meet that recommendation. The other option would just be leave it completely open and not disqualify anyone out of the gate. So we're looking at that with the actual RFP document, and I'd welcome feedback from the committee on their thoughts on that. And then the other piece that I put in the report is that we would get as I've already said, get a price on the regular annual audit of the financial statements for compliance with public sector accounting standards. And then on top of that, also ask through this RFP process for a price for incremental work wherein we would design or have the auditor advise us on a design of more of a compliance internal audit based program where they could supply staff throughout the year that would come in periodically to conduct processes and audit procedures that would look at compliance with policy on a consistent basis, internal controls, things of that nature. It's really less about auditing the TNRD staff in general, but more getting comfort around our are the senior management doing a good job of enforcing those policies and making sure that they've been put in place, that they're being followed properly and consistently, which goes to that oversight that was talked about before. That's basically sort of how we've been putting together the plan for this RFP process. The one other piece that I would speak to is there was another recommendation in the BDO report, which, if I just find it, they recommend the TNRD consider carrying out a fraud risk assessment on a periodic basis. That's still under consideration. So that the intent with that is not part of this RFP process, but once we're through this RFP process, we might still consider a separate engagement around doing a specific fraud assessment.
Thank you. I guess the first item is term limits. To me, we can eliminate some of these things and then maybe get to the overall, but term limits, thoughts, comments?
Well, I'm torn because there is an element of economy for the taxpayer to engage a firm that's familiar with the lines of business of the organization. And given that, a company knows about eco depots and they know about some of the relationships that we have with our larger contractors, that assists them. The other side of the coin is this notion that familiarity breeds contempt. And I think it's our job to kind of balance that in there. I would like to see a 5-year kind of commitment in there, and I think that would necessarily do it. The only comment I would make is that you've purposely decided to exclude KPMG, and I agree with that, and not to reflect on their auditing. I think just more a reflection on the length of time they've been doing it. But I'm wondering whether or not you gave any consideration to include excluding BDO from a future audit call.
Yeah, it's a good question. I had not given consideration to specifically excluding them. I mean, you could suggest that there's a bit of a conflict of interest in a recommendation that we change audit firms, and BDO would be one of the firms standing to gain an audit client. And in terms of the whole concept of term limits, when I look around the province, I really don't see any other local governments that I'm aware of that have set anything like that. I don't think that there's any kind of inherent conflict of interest in the fact that BDO has done this forensic audit for us that would prevent us from hiring them as a audit firm for a regular audit of financial statements going forward. Like I said, there are additional firms to choose from in town. And so I guess the question would be, if we exclude KPMG and BDO, now we're starting to narrow the field of who's actually qualified that would be potential candidates.
Remind me what our previous, say in the last 5 years, our average cost of our audit, external audit was.
In a normal year, it was about $30,000.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So in a normal year, we're spending $30,000. Last year, we spent $530,000, largely on the backs of a $500,000 audit by BDO. So we've expended 20 years worth of auditing, quite frankly, in one go. I just think that the optics of that and the approach that that firm would take would be in many ways, in many respects, a continuation of the forensic audit piece. I want to put that to bed. And my sense would be, if there are 3 other firms that would be considered local and would be considered competent, that you exclude both KPMG and BDO for this 5-year period going forward, and that we start with a clean slate for auditors and get back into a kind of a regular cycle.
Yeah, I guess my concern with that, and I understand where you're coming from and the optics of it. You know, from a procurement point of view, we're still bound with having sort of, what's the term I should be using? It's sort of the open, not competitive, non-restrictive procurement process. And with KPMG, I can see that because they've been our auditors for a number of years, that we might consider them to be ineligible this round just because of that idea of a term limit that we want to institute. And we should therefore make that consistent going forward with other firms that we set a term limit. But to suggest that we exclude KPMG because we don't think the optics would look at, I'm concerned that it creates a less than a best practice around procurement.
Director Quinn.
Thank you. I kind of agree with both of you. I just want to focus on you budgeted or you're contemplating budgeting 30 grand. If a firm changes, there's going to be a learning curve that will cost more money. It's the same as if you change a lawyer in the middle of a case. They got to relearn everything. The advantage of staying with KPMG is that they know it. They know all the bits and pieces. So they would be able to probably come in with a lower price. The disadvantage is over optics. And I don't want to put our new board in the position of saying, you're just the same as the last months. So I like the idea of changing regularly. I'm not sure 5 years is enough. Maybe 5 years with an option to renew for 5 might be the thing to do. And looking down the road at elections, you don't want to stick board 1, board 2. The third board was having to change auditors right smack in the middle of an election. That's just looking forward. So I think we should just go with the invitation to people that haven't done it before, and let KPMG know it's it really is not any reflection on themselves, but it's time that we have to look forward, knowing that it'll probably cost some more. And also, if we go down to this extra stuff, I guess you would create the RFP to create that as a separate subject, a separate line item or a separate chunk of money. But it's just my thoughts on it.
If I could, cognizant, I think we want to be out of here by noon. I think, are we all comfortable with a 10-year that we would limit the audit to a period of no longer than 10 years? I think that's a reasonable recommendation.
Yeah.
Are we all comfortable with that? So I think step one, okay,
Go, just a quick question, Deanna, is there any legal implications of excluding someone?
sorry, I didn't hear you.
Are there any legal implications of excluding someone?
No, you can do that.
Not with this process, because it's not an RFP. Because of the threshold, we don't actually have to issue it as an RFP. We would just invite proposals. So the best practice is a minimum of 3 be invited to bid. So we can make that decision as to who we would like to extend an invitation to.
Okay, supplementary to that, it's what, just remind me what the top of the limit is before we have to go to tender. Is it 75,000?
75,000.
Okay, so there's a lot of room to maneuver in there. Thank you.
Yeah, and are there 3 firms, if we were to eliminate KPMG, BDO, are there 3 qualified firms or more out there today?
Well, it's a good question. Definitely 2, because there's MNP here in town and Grant Thornton. I'd have to consider who a third firm that might be qualified. In the past, we had always invited KPMG, BDO, and Daly and Company, who then merged and became Grant Thornton.
Yeah.
So I'd have to consider whether there's a third local firm with the resources to do the audit.
Because I think that whether or not we go to BDO, to me, in my mind, I support Director Christian view a little bit, although the audit that they did was more Vancouver based. I think the local people could be a completely different team.
It certainly would be.
Yeah, and I think if we don't have three, then we need to consider BDO. If we had three competent firms that we could go to, I would be comfortable saying restricting BDO and KPMG. But I think that we need to have three people that we would send the request for proposals to. So does that give you some direction?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could just respond to a couple of comments earlier, just on the subject of price. In the report, I did mention, and again in this meeting, that historically the cost of the financial statement audit has been around 30,000. Now, last year it was roughly double that.
Yeah.
Because the forensic audit had recently been released and the firm saw us as a higher audit risk to the firm and their reputation, and they wanted to make sure they get it right. And there was more resources brought in terms of a second look by partners outside of the local office and so on. So there was it was definitely a higher price last year.
Yeah, we
But I
are
really
aware of that.
Yeah, what I really don't know until the RFP actually takes place is what kind of pricing we're looking at going forward. It could continue to be double what the historic was.
I suspect that is going to be closer to
Yeah,
reality.
so I just wanted to make that,
Anybody going forward is going to say, in light of
Yeah.
the forensic audit, in light of the past, this has to be a bit more in-depth than maybe necessary, but if we're gonna get involved, this is probably more like a $50,000-$60,000 exercise.
yeah, and so I just wanted to clarify the comments around pricing, and then, but again, it's really unknown at this point until we go through the RFP process. And then the other piece I was just going to talk about, so again, historically, when it comes to the agreement we've reached, so yes, if we're looking at a 10-year term limit, but we've generally gone and done an RFP or request for proposal for 5-year pricing. So we've ended up entering into an agreement with the audit firm for a commitment for 5 years and then another 5. And in fact, the last time, the way I structured it was a firm commitment for 2 years with options to renew for an additional 3, with the thought that if we do switch audit firms and after 2 years, we find we're really unhappy with the service, we're not committed for another 3. We have a 5-year window, but there's really only a maximum 2-year commitment that we're held to.
Committee comfortable with that? I think that's a very wise approach. Yeah, so we're comfortable with that.
Just one further comment, Al.
Yeah.
Firms, I guess, assess the risk when they take a client on. I believe once we've got our policies all completed, which fit the BDO forensic audit, will some way mitigate that, make them feel more comfortable, rather than, oh gosh, you really want a bid kind of thing. Thank you.
Personally, I'm not so sure I agree. I think it might have sent alarms up for others. So anyways, Mr. Ray, you have a comment?
Just that the optimist in me hopes that will be the case, but I'm not sure the realist in me is as hopeful.
Yeah. So with 2 years with the potential to extend for 3 up to 5. And we would look at term limits and 10-year basis, so it could be a couple of contracts. Yeah, the question I have a little bit, this is the regular audit, and this I do think we should be budgeting more money than less. But if we were to do an in-depth audit of a department or some more specific in-depth work, would we build that into this external contract, or are we looking for arm's length third party to do that? And what kind of costs are we looking at?
So again, you're absolutely right. The way I'm structuring this RFP at this point is to, we're sending it out to at least 3 firms to say, give us a price on doing the annual financial statement audit, whatever you feel that, needs to be in a competitive setting. And then we also want, as an incremental separate, layer, and it may be an hourly rate, it may be something of that nature, to say, to do this kind of compliance-based testing, what kind of rate would you charge us? And based on those prices, we could kind of determine, following that, what the scope would be, how many hours we would anticipate being necessary to get a real benefit out of it, and look at kind of the total price. The intent would be, and I've said in the report here, it's not necessary for us to choose the same firm. I personally think there would be some economies of scale and benefits if a audit firm has a staff member who's coming and looking at compliance with internal controls and policy. That does create some audit evidence that goes towards the audit of the financial statements. So there can be some economies of scale and efficiencies for them in terms of the effort they put out on the financial statement audit. But we wouldn't necessarily be bound to use the same firm. If we had a much lower hourly rate from one firm and a lower rate for the financial statement audit for some reason from another firm, we could potentially mix and match. But at this point, the idea would be to ask, as part of that request for proposal, that they include with their proposal some kind of a rate around doing such procedures. And then we can evaluate it based on that, independent of whether we hire them for the financial statement audit or not. Yeah, and potentially, I could foresee them putting forward pricing to say, well, if you hire us to do the annual financial statement audit, the price would be this. And if you don't, and this is a standalone engagement, we're going to have maybe a little bit more overhead involved as a standalone engagement, the price would be different, and give us sort of 2 tiers to choose from.
Yeah, I concur. The only other comment I'd make is there was a recommendation in the forensic audit that the organization consider an internal auditor. That's a recommendation I do not agree with, but I'm wondering, is that a consideration? And if that were a consideration, would it not implicate the cost of external auditing?
Yeah, so the actual recommendation, and I agree, they had a recommendation. I'm just looking up the wording. I think it's under corporate governance activities and oversight, the second page. They should ensure access to internal audit capacity to carry out the audits, engage external advisors where there are capacity constraints or special investigations are warranted. So I think they're recognizing in that recommendation that there's a choice between creating a sort of internal audit service utilizing like a specifically hired staff versus using those external audit firms to conduct processes and audit procedures that would cover off that same oversight and provide comfort. So I don't see a conflict between the two. I think it fits right in with their recommendation. In my own mind, between the choice of a staff position versus utilizing these external consulting services, I think that's the better way to go myself. Certainly, I think it'll be more economical.
Yeah, I concur. I just wanted to better understand your thinking on that. I appreciate that, Doug.
Yeah, but it's a good point, and I agree with Director Kristen. So I know Director Quinn is nodding too. So I think from our point of view, I think we like this approach as opposed to an internal auditor. And the other thought I had is that this internal, in-depth kind of role, if we go in the request for proposals, it might be good to limit that to a 2-year period in keeping with the 2-year and possible extension, and have that also as a could be extended with, or we could go out to look at another party for that work if the board thinks that that's the better approach.
Yeah, and I guess in my mind, if it's built into this RFP process, it could be similar to the audit for financial statements, where you're really kind of looking at a 2 to 5 year commitment to use that firm. And then another RFP process would go out. We'd still be able to consider this function, in conjunction with the audit of the financial statements, or potentially, split it between two different firms.
Yeah. Okay, I think give me some direction. Are there any other issues on this? No, I just I got my critical hat on today. So I was going to say, when a report to the board, you say roughly every 5 years. I was going to say every 4 or 5 years is. I'm not so sure I like an audit. It's roughly the word, just in that there's some loose. And then there's a tone here, and I don't want to be and not a criticism. I just think in terms of proper protocol, saying staff plan. Sorry, and I didn't bring my glasses. Staff plan to follow a similar process in 2022. I still think we have to be a little bit careful here. Staff is recommending that we follow a similar process, and I think we need to make sure that that kind of staff are recommending. I think we've got to be careful when we make statements that staff are doing. It sounds like there's no role for the committee of the board because, we're doing it. I just suggested in reports going to the board, we should be super sensitive to the fact the board, this committee, even, we don't have any authority. We recommend to the board, and it's the board's decision. And I think just my suggestion in future reports, try to phrase it in that kind of language. If there aren't any other issues.
Recommendation.
Yep, seconded. Call the question. All in favor? Motion is carried. Then do we have that's which is no new business that I'm aware of.
Just on a point of personal privilege, Mr. Chairman, I want to acknowledge your leadership of the audit committee through tumultuous time, and I don't. The rest of you are too young to remember a television show called Columbo, and it was prefaced around this police investigator who the case was all ready to be closed, and he would say, "Just one thing bothering me about this," and he would open up a new area of investigation and discussion. And I found that you did that with poignant inquiry, and I think that that's a good trait as a chair of the audit committee, and I appreciate working with you, Al. Thank you.
What? Thank you. But I was very worried when you brought up Columbo. You're going to say that The guy acted like he was dumb all the time. But he was really quite smart. I'm not so sure that's a compliment. And by the way, I'm dumb enough to announce yesterday that I'm actually running for mayor. So I am dumb sometimes. Okay. Yeah. Anyways, if there's no new business, a motion to adjourn. Like, Director Quinn, second by Director Christian, all in favor, motion is carried, we're adjourned. Thank you. No, well, yeah, a bunch of people twisted her arm. The guy that was gonna run is